I realize that I'm the only thing standing between you and happy hour.
Make it short.
Yeah, exactly. Probably you're imagining me either a la Tom and Jerry as a wheel of cheese or a bottle of beer, depending on your predilections. I don't know which. As long as you hear the words, yes, it can be beer and cheese or beer cheese. Quickly before I start, I want to sort of just say what an honor it is to be on a panel with Larry and Teresa, both of whom are my friends, but also my mentors, and to recognize our panelist who is missing, Megan McNamara, and our thoughts are all with Megan right now. So, okay, I'll begin then. After the Civil War, Secretary of State William Seward, even as he recovered from illness, an assassination attempt, and his wife's death, was in an expansive mood, though that mood was not necessarily shared by his compatriots in Congress, nor by the American public. Between 1865 and 1869, Seward made offers to purchase Alaska, the Danish West Indies, which is St. Thomas and St. John, and Samana Bay in the Dominican Republic, and maybe even the whole island of Hispaniola. Seward also oversaw the 1867 U.S. naval takeover of Midway Island as a strategically located coaling station, halfway between the Pacific coast and Asia. Seward also, less successfully, set acquisitive eyes, at least, on Samoa, Greenland, and Iceland. Of these, only the Alaska purchase came to fruition on Seward's watch, as the treaty for the $7.2 million purchase was ratified by the U.S. Senate in April of 1867. Seward did conclude negotiations to purchase St. Thomas and St. John in October of that year, but after sitting on the signed treaty until 1870, the U.S. Senate refused to ratify the purchase. So, what's now known as the U.S. Virgin Islands would not be officially sold to the U.S. until 1916. But Seward's imperial legacy outlasted his retirement in 1869, as his friends and protégés would play key roles in the 1875 Reciprocity Treaty with Hawaii, the 1877 Treaty of Friendship with Samoa, and turn-of-the-century territorial acquisitions of Puerto Rico, Guam, American Samoa, and also the Panama Canal Zone. Today, I'm going to be talking a little bit about circulating humor about Seward's land grabs as they appeared in the popular press. If you've seen me talk before, I'm into the popular press. I hope to frame their sometimes racist and always at least ethnocentric jabs at U.S. postbellum expansionism as critiques not just of foreign policy, but also of the greed and graft attendant to these negotiations in ways that would come to define the Gilded Age, as we've been talking about it all day. On December 18, 1867, the New York Tribune printed a Mark Twain piece titled "Information Wanted," which it's titled in at least one reprint, Mr. Seward's Real Estate Transactions. I like that very much. In which Twain purports to seek, quote, any information respecting such islands, if any, as the government is going to purchase. Twain is asking, he says, for his uncle, who has already tried but failed to homestead on the Caribbean island of St. Thomas, but, quote, thinks they are unsettled there. Twain's alleged uncle somehow caught all of the 7 kinds of fever they have down here, leaving him, quote, a good deal annoyed when it appeared that he was going to die. This is very early Twain, right? After getting well, Twain's uncle started a farm, but unfortunately, quote, that great storm came and washed most of it over to Gibraltar or around there somewhere. His next homesteading scheme was ruined by the sudden appearance of an active volcano. Finally, while on board a ship prospecting for safer land on the island, an earthquake struck and lifted his ship out into one of the interior counties. Twain was only mildly exaggerating here, as in November and December of that year, 1867, St. Thomas was struck with a hurricane, an earthquake, a tornado, a tidal wave. So Twain is sort of doing a version of hurricane science denial, I suppose. As a result, Twain reports, with some understatement, his uncle was left discouraged. Next, we'll move to a January 21st, 1868 letter to the Alta California. Twain referred to these natural disasters and illnesses again in this letter. I won't go through all of it. But in one part, Twain writes, quote, we bought the island of St. Thomas not long ago. We may have got it for a bargain, for its inhabitants were all dying off with the fevers of the country, and it promised to be nothing more than a cemetery in a little while, an eligible place to die in. Here, Seward's potential acquisition, proposed for strategic, geopolitical, and military purposes — he wanted naval bases — is reframed merely as investing in a burial plot. Twain tops off the joke by hinting at other potential purchases to be made based on similarly bad decisions. Quote, "Puerto Rico is undergoing a similar siege of supernatural disasters," Twain writes, "and the people of Washington begin to suspect from these signs that we must have purchased Puerto Rico too." Twain ends the article by connecting to Seward's acquisition of Alaska, or as Twain calls it here, Walrussia, noting that some congressmen are reluctant to authorize the $7+ million payment for the territory, and wondering if, quote, "perhaps we had better hold on to that money and buy some more earthquakes with it." Twain wasn't alone in yoking together Alaska and the Danish West Indies for the sake of comic critique. In December 1867, the New Orleans Times, in an article about the potential purchase of St. Thomas and St. John, quipped, "We learn from the New York papers that Mr. Seward's late purchase in the West Indies, the island of St. John's, is rather a lively little place. If our bountiful premier would only contrive some way to tow it up to Walrussia, where it could shake down the icebergs and boil out the snowdrifts, it might be considered cheap at the price paid for it." Twain also mentions Walrussia in his earlier piece, Information Wanted. There, he writes that his roving uncle had also, quote, "tried Walrussia, but the bears kept after him so much and kept him so on the jump, as it were, that he had to leave the country." So that letter, Information Wanted, was pretty popular. I found 18 reprints of it, at least, and an ad, which you see here, for an April 1868 lecture in California, alludes to it, saying, quote, "There are some who know of the troubles of his uncle when he went to St. Thomas about the time of the earthquake, who would like to be informed whether he finally got the quiet place he was in quest of. If within the scope of this lecture, Mark might give this little piece of information to quiet the minds of his friends." Oh, I can see it better if I use my glasses. That's interesting. These two pieces aren't Mark Twain's only rendering of Alaska as Walrussia for comic effect. Also that same winter, in December 1867, in another newspaper squib, The Facts in the Case of the Senate Doorkeeper, which if you haven't read, you should, the narrator describes, quote, "some solemn, sentimental bosh by the chair," this is the chair of the Senate, "concerning one of the new senators from Walrussia who had lost his way in the wilds of his native land and had nothing to eat for 18 days but an iceberg." Alaska is not the main butt of this piece's joke. This is merely the moment at which the Senate doorkeeper, who's Twain, interrupts official Senate business yet again — he's been doing it through the whole piece — to introduce his bill on women's suffrage, and then he gets fired. Here, a passing jab about senators from Alaska lost in its vast expanse is just one in a series of jokes about Senate business. It merely trades on the popularity of circulating comic tropes about the newly purchased territory and its political relationship to the United States. This last joke reiterates common stereotypes about Alaska, which are also apparent in this cartoon, which is from 1867, Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper, and it's titled "Our New Senators." The senators appear to be a Tlingit Indian and a penguin, although the penguin is referred to as Mr. Seal. Don't ask me to close read that particular substitution. Both wring humor from the jarring juxtaposition of the perceived savage wilderness of Alaska with the alleged civilization of the Senate. Such jokes circulated widely in 1867. There's another clearly racist joke. I think it's reprinted from the New York Herald in the Stockton, California Daily Evening Herald. And I'll just read that here. "In less than 6 months, we shall have several blubber-eating representatives and 2 senators clothed in walrus hide representing Walrussia in Congress." And here's where it gets even weirder. "They then will be able to compare notes with the black congressmen from the southern states and exchange civilities of walrus meat and train oil for hog and hominy." So as we see in a lot of other ethnic humor at the time, particularly that in comic almanacs, newspapers, humor periodicals, even specifically targeted racial stereotypes tend to give way to this kind of cross-racialization whose main purpose is to draw lines of in-groups and out-groups, right? Both of those sets of new senators being out. Twain wrote all 4 of those letters I've just referred to in that winter of 1867 and 1868, when he was importantly living and working in Washington, D.C. He was initially there as personal secretary for a Nevada senator. That didn't work out too well. While there, Twain learned the ways of Washington, its rules and misrule, seeing the crush of lobbyists, cabinet intrigue, congressional business, which he saw firsthand, and how, of course, the legislative sausage was made. As such, Twain probably knew what he was talking about when he opened his January 1868 letter from Mark Twain, that's a letter to the Alta California, with the barb, quote, "All Washington is laughing about our unfortunate purchases of territory." Tellingly, by that winter, in all these newspaper pieces, Mark Twain takes for granted readers' familiarity with the term Walrussia as a stand-in for Alaska. He does not mention the words Alaska or even Russian America, which was common at the time, at all. Twain is banking on his audience's understanding and acceptance of that term. Walrussia is an epithet for Alaska Territory. So this gained traction during Seward's 1867, the first half of the year, his negotiations with Russia, and up through the Senate's approval of it in April. Where did that come from? A couple different theories, but probably the New York Tribune. April 29th, 1867, the Tribune ran a short piece critiquing the acquisition and sarcastically suggesting a burlesque name for the new territory. You guessed it, Walrussia. The article in its entirety, just here, reads, I'm going to read a long quote, Matt. "The future name of the Arctic territory recently purchased from Russia remains in abeyance. We have heard of parents too poor to give their children fit names, but never before of bantlings too sorry to receive such names. We venture to suggest at once, in recognition of the most valued inhabitants of this western Greenland, and as a compliment to the great nation which does us the honor to pocket our money, that Gov. Seward's hard bargain be known as Walrussia." Less than 3 months later, another New York paper was pleading for journalists to stop it already with the Walrussia. July 24th, 1867, I was pointing at the wrong one, the New York Evening Post beseeched its peers, "If newspapers and their correspondents make it a continual practice to apply the ridiculous and disparaging slang title of Walrussia to our newly acquired territory, there is some danger that the public may acquire the habit of calling that country by it, as if it were the legal and proper name. We therefore beg that the government will lose no time in affixing a legal name to the territory just as soon as possession is obtained." The piece continues after a little bit that I'm skipping. "Do not let us fasten a ridiculous title upon a large and important portion of our national territory by means of a paltry newspaper joke." So the Post writer here is not just being a killjoy, and in the end was right to worry about the pernicious influence of the spread of a joking name for that newly purchased territory. I did a keywords searches for Walrussia, and one version of it, it's sometimes spelled WAL-Russia. Between 1867 and 1900, this is through the America's Historical Newspaper Database at the American Antiquarian Society. I got 631 hits, which even for someone who spends a lot of their time tracking reprints, that is a lot. And those hits show both its immediate, but also its lasting virality. So a pejorative name for Alaska that has more commonly come down to us, Seward's Icebox, in comparison only garners 51 total hits in its various spellings and variations. So I read and cataloged 203 mentions of Walrussia between the Tribune and the Post articles to see what would happen between that time. And my dear and poor graduate assistant, Mary Stewart, did another 250 plus. Our cataloging reveals a story. I won't go through the details of it all now, but the basic story is the transmutation of a joke that passes from satire to humor to tacit acceptance as serious. Again, its probable origination was in the New York Tribune, though I've seen some places that credit the Detroit Advertiser, and I can't figure it out. But so its origination was part of a biting critique of the purchase itself, right? In this way, the term Walrussia is meant as satiric mockery of the purchase, highlighting its distance from the heart of the U.S. industry and also its wildness. We'll see more of that in a minute. But when other papers reprint the name Walrussia without that attendant critique, they sap the nickname of its satire, instead highlighting it as harmlessly fun wordplay or comic refiguring. That's what I mean when I say it moves from satire to humor. Eventually, the huge virality of the name Walrussia also led it to be pretty quickly wielded without any sense of irony or humor. Many of the pieces we read just used the term matter-of-factly. So because we hit ourselves, we logged the form and content of most of these articles. We didn't get to all 631. We got through 455, I think. Among the more widely reprinted bits is a joke allegedly made by General Sherman. There's only 13 of these, but I like it, so I will quote it here. This quote is from July 20th, so it's in that first phase, Chicago Tribune. This is Sherman, opinion of Walrussia is concise and thus pronounced, give him 7 millions more to take it back and be thankful to get off so cheap. Right? So that's still satire. Another fun comic use of Walrussia can be found in an advertisement for a Bowery burlesque titled The Fairies of Walrussia. So I found the advertisement for it. The script, I'm sure, does not exist anymore. Other contemporary comic treatments of the Alaska Purchase traffic in similar jests about Seward making a bad deal, and relatedly, the region being a wasteland empty of civilized people. By empty of civilized people, read white Americans, right? But full of wild and dangerous animals and full of indigenous peoples. So I'll just go through a couple political cartoons. There's a third one that's in the program that I will just not talk about. These are fairly self-evident. Both of these that I'll look at are from Frank Leslie's Budget of Fun, both in 1867. The first is called Two Peter Funks. Now, Peter Funk is the 19th century nickname for a swindler, right? In this cartoon, Seward is swindled by Russia. The caption reads, the Russian stranger says, I say, little boy, want to trade? I've got a fine lot of bears, seals, icebergs, and Eskimo. They're of no use to me. I'll swap them for those boats you've got. Billy, like other foolish boys, jumps at the idea. The two negotiators stand on an iceberg as the Russian Peter Funk gestures towards mountains crawling with polar bears, with seals playing below, and playing the wildness of the land, right? We'll just see this basic trope over and over. Seward here is depicted as a child. This is common in a lot of political caricature. A foolish boy making a bad trade due to overzealousness and naivete. Here's another. September 1867, this cartoon is called An Excellent Investment. Obviously, that is sarcastic. The caption here reads, this eligible post office to be disposed of, situated in a delightful spot with pleasant neighbors, a few minutes walk from Sitka, Walrussia, apply to W.H. Seward, real estate agent and letter writer. That's a whole different critique. Washington, D.C. The polar bears and wolves in the foreground figure Alaska as a wilderness and seeks humor from the juxtaposition of a symbol of American civilization, a post office, with that untamed wasteland. So it works the same way as the Senate jokes. Like other humor about Alaska, the caption also represents Seward as a real estate agent. This moniker situates the purchases as disreputable and private business deals, right? Seward's purchase, instead of his acts in the national interest. Another notable example is William Hemphill Bell's 1873 comic book narrative, Quiddities of an Alaska Trip. So Bell was a U.S. Army officer. He was chief, I don't know how to pronounce it, commissariat of the Department of Alaska in 1869 and 1870. The comic book mostly, and this is a very early comic book, it mostly covers the arduous journey just to get to his post in Sitka. And it's the arduous journey of the protagonist, who's simply named the Major. But the book's final illustrations do depict travel in Alaska, so I will point to them here. Beginning with the Major's misadventures, this is not shown here, misadventures traveling via canoe. So while he's on the canoe, if you're outdoors people and you've spent a lot of time on canoes, you can appreciate this. He moved the plug of tobacco in his mouth from one side to the other and was tipped out of the canoe, right? Also snowshoes, which are ineffective in Alaska because it's not snowing, it's always raining there. Right? He then hires, and this is this image, a native guide to take him to Sitka. As they traverse the wilderness, Bell makes a joke juxtaposing Seward's soaring rhetoric about Alaska's natural beauty and more importantly, its resources, with the reality of the journey. If I could, I'm sorry to bother the keynote speaker here, but there's a word I can't pronounce.
It's not pronounceable.
it's a, yeah, so with the early dawn, who knows? Always end a conference with a callback. This is important, right? Major is again on the road and crosses some of the bottomlands mentioned by the Honorable William H. Seward and others, seated upon his snowshoes. The guide said that Mr. Seward and others may have found bottom, but that he hadn't. And then the bear, of course. There's always a bear, right? A sudden rustling of the bushes on one side of the trail attracted the attention of the major, who saw a bear emerging therefrom. Not having lost a bear, the major knew that this one did not belong to him. He don't know which has the most pernicious effect upon a man's nerves, earthquakes or bears, which is a nice callback to the Caribbean stuff too. These instances of visual satire criticizing the Alaska Purchase connect to the Walrussia cognomen and to Mark Twain's jabs about Alaska and St. Thomas through their shared incredulity at post-war U.S. territorial expansion, expressing suspicion about the territories themselves, but also about their relative worth, and also about the act of expansion during Reconstruction, and also about the very methods of purchase. There was a lot of accusations of graft and bribery, particularly with the Alaska Purchase. For this talk, I got to read William Seward's son's autobiography. Seward's son was the Assistant Secretary of State and was in charge of some of these things. And there's also, and he talks a little bit about some of these allegations, but a historian sort of does some talking about this. During the process of the Alaska Purchase, a number of people were accused of accepting bribes and abusing their political and public influence. And the public cynicism about government corruption was only reinforced at that time. You see how we're getting to the Gilded Age here, right? So these works were, that I've studied are between 1867 and 1868. If the Gilded Age is said to have started with Grant's presidency in 1869, maybe this doesn't quite count, but at lunch Stephen told me it was fine. So thank you, Stephen. Also, let me quote Nate Wolff, who describes the Gilded Age as denoting, quote, a period of rampant greed and appetite of excess, while also capturing the cynicism, bitterness, and exhaustion that attended the period's major scandals. So by that definition, too, these comic critiques of Seward's attempted purchases certainly are Gilded Age satire. In Not Quite Hope, Nate Wolff argues that the Gilded Age is defined by both a phenomenon, political corruption, and a set of feelings about it, and that those feelings are importantly negative and anxiety-fueled, which are also most of the feelings that I have in my life. Wolff explores how the Gilded Age political novel as a genre captures everyday negotiations with political emotion that define times of ongoing crisis, when a cluster of wearying, anxious emotional states comes to seem like both a grave threat to citizens' agency and a primary way people feel political, and that's a really important part, right? And I want to end by suggesting that distrustful, world-weary political humor treating postbellum territorial expansion works in a similar way, right? Nate, if your argument sort of, and as you were talking about last night, gives us a particular way to think about form, especially the form of a novel, I think we can also use that to think about form and the form of periodical humor, right? If literature scholars are interested in studying these things, in novels, we should also be interested in studying these things in the periodical medium, right? That might be a topic for a fully different symposium, but all of these things are working in that similar way, right? Trafficking in an affect of pessimism and desolation. Desolation, I mean both as a feeling and a description of land, in order to point towards, if not a better, at least a different way to heal and to grow the nation. So I'll end there. And this connected a little bit to, Matt, your comment last night after Nate's talk, sort of about newspapers and magazines and how that fits there. One last thing, let me, so that we can give Mary, this is my graduate assistant who spent 60 hours or so logging these things so that I could get 3 sentences for this talk with some data. So first year PhD student, so thanks very much to Mary for that. So, and I'll stop, thanks.